In the darkest corridors of Hampton Court Palace, where flickering torches made shadows stretch like skeletal fingers, desire was no longer a private matter but a weapon of state. Imagine this, a king whose lust was so consuming that it shattered marriages, dismantled centuries of tradition, and turned queens into corpses. This is not a love story, it is the tale of Henry VIII, whose sexual obsessions bled England of stability, faith, and humanity. And you, how would you survive in a world where refusing the king's bed could cost you your head? When Henry Tudor ascended the throne in 1509, England celebrated a golden prince. Athletic, educated, fluent in Latin and music, he seemed the very image of Renaissance chivalry. His tall frame dominated the tilt-yard, his charm dazzled courtiers, and his marriage to the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon was hailed as the union of virtue and strength. To the public eye, it was the perfect match, youth, power, and piety intertwined. But perfection was an illusion. Beneath the gleam of tournaments and pageantry, the seeds of obsession were already germinating. Even in those first years, whispers crept through the court. The king's wandering eye, his conviction that his virility was proof of divine favor, his inability to resist the lure of young women who served near his wife. In a country still bound tightly by Catholic law, where adultery was a mortal sin, Henry cultivated his own mythology. He convinced himself that God had blessed him uniquely, that his appetite was not weakness, but a sacred mandate. If he desired, then surely heaven desired through him. Catherine endured the humiliation with regal dignity. She gave Henry years of loyalty, but her body betrayed her. Miscarriages, stillbirths, the absence of a surviving male heir. In Henry's mind, this was not divine chance, but Catherine's failure. He began visiting her chambers less, parading mistresses before her eyes, forcing her to smile as her ladies emerged from his bed with glittering jewels. And here the game began, a court where proximity to the king's lust meant both glory and ruin, where every woman was forced to calculate, would yielding save me or destroy me? Catherine of Aragon's story is one of endurance that borders on tragedy. For 24 years, she wore her crown with dignity. Even as Henry stripped her of respect piece by piece, the Spanish princess had entered England as a young bride, prepared to honor both faith and husband. But time and loss aged her in ways Henry refused to forgive. To him, the unforgivable crime was not treason or betrayal. It was her inability to give him a son. A queen who could not deliver a male heir, in Henry's eyes, had failed the divine purpose of marriage itself. The spectacle of humiliation became routine. Imagine standing in your own palace while the man you call husband flaunts other women before your face. Catherine endured this again and again, her chambers filling with jewels and laughter from those who had just left Henry's bed. Her composure was praised even by her enemies, but Henry saw dignity not as strength, but as defiance, a quiet challenge to his authority. And that challenge enraged him. The Tudor court was a glittering yet suffocating trap. Proximity to the king meant power, but it also meant danger. Ladies in waiting, some barely out of girlhood, were caught between vows to husbands and the unspoken command to please the king. Who could refuse him? Refusal could mean disgrace for their families, accusations of disloyalty, or worse. Submission promised wealth, jewels, perhaps a brief rise in influence, but it also carried the risk of pregnancy, disgrace, or being discarded the moment his passion cooled. Unlike the French King Francis I, who maintained mistresses with at least a veneer of discretion, Henry was brutal in his displays. He paraded lovers like trophies, ensuring Catherine's humiliation was public and complete. Each affair chipped away at the sanctity of the marriage bond, but Henry did not care. In his mind, his virility was proof of divine favor. God had chosen him to rule and to conquer, both on the battlefield and in the bedchamber. And so a dangerous precedent was set. The king's bedroom became an extension of his throne room, and every private passion a matter of national consequence. What do you think? If you were in Catherine's place, would you resist, or would you bow your head and survive? By 1519, the careful balance Catherine had maintained shattered under the weight of Henry's open betrayal. Elizabeth Blount, known as Bessie, became one of the first women to rise and fall in the king's dangerous orbit. Unlike others, she succeeded where Catherine had failed. She bore Henry a healthy son. The child, Henry Fitzroy, was quickly acknowledged and granted the title Duke of Richmond. To the court, it was a shocking moment. To Catherine, it was a public declaration that the fault for their lack of heirs lay not with the king, but squarely on her. Henry's joy was almost grotesque in its intensity. He paraded the boy as living proof of his potency, showering him with honors that should have belonged to a legitimate prince. Imagine the cruelty. The queen, who had suffered miscarriage after miscarriage, forced to watch her husband exalt an illegitimate child as if he were England's rightful future. For Catherine, humiliation became ritual. For Henry, it was a performance of power, his way of telling the world that his seed was blessed and holy, no matter who carried it. This episode revealed the dangerous shift in Henry's view of women. They were no longer partners, but vessels. Some brought him glory, others shame. Bessie's reward was temporary, lands, jewels, fleeting favor, but her role ended the moment she had fulfilled her purpose. Like so many before and after, she became another discarded pawn. The court, however, had learned an important lesson. Families began to position their daughters deliberately, knowing that royal attention could mean fortune or ruin. The Tudor palace became less a place of governance than a breeding ground for ambition and fear. Every smile, every glance, every whispered word could be misinterpreted as an invitation or a refusal. Both were equally dangerous. Henry's sexual mythology grew bolder after Fitzroy's birth. His ability to sire a son was divine confirmation, he claimed. If Catherine failed, then it was not his fault, but God's judgment on her. The king's desire had become law, and his body the measure of heaven's will. And here, for the first time, England saw the fusion of lust and politics, a union that would soon tear the very fabric of the kingdom. But tell me, if you had a daughter in such a court, would you risk placing her near Henry, hoping for glory, or keep her far away to save her life? If Bessie Blount revealed Henry's hunger for heirs, the arrival of the Boleyn sisters showed the true extent of his cruelty. First came Mary Boleyn, the elder, pushed forward by her ambitious family. She slipped easily into the role of mistress, willing to yield where Catherine would not. Courtiers mocked her as the great whore, but Henry cared little. She bore him at least one child, perhaps two, though he never acknowledged them. Mary's fate was typical of Henry's pattern: intense pursuit, lavish gifts, months of pleasure, then dismissal when her usefulness ended. She was married off to a minor courtier and quietly exiled. Her royal children left unspoken, her body another stepping stone in the king's endless game. But Mary's younger sister, Anne, was different. She had seen Mary's rise and her brutal fall. She knew too well what became of women who surrendered too easily. Anne refused to be Henry's mistress, even as he showered her with jewels and promises. She withheld herself, turning her denial into power. Her laughter, her wit, her calculated glances created a hunger Henry had never known. For the first time, the king was not the hunter, but the prey. This shift drove Henry into madness. He wrote letters, desperate and vulgar, calling her breasts his pretty duckies, begging for her embrace like a lovesick boy rather than a sovereign ruler. Imagine the danger of such obsession, an entire nation's fate hanging on whether a single woman would share the king's bed. Anne's defiance ignited a fire larger than desire. Henry's frustration with Catherine hardened into fury, his need for Anne transforming into a justification to break with Rome itself. What began as lust for a clever woman became the spark for a revolution that would rip England from Catholic Europe. Think about it. Anne was no queen yet, just a lady at court. Could you have resisted Henry's pressure for 7 years, knowing that others who said no had lost their lives? Henry's obsession with Anne Boleyn grew into a national crisis. What had begun as infatuation evolved into a political and religious earthquake. For 7 long years, the king pursued her, begging, raging, promising that she would be more than mistress. She would be queen. But to make her queen, Catherine of Aragon had to be cast aside. The king's request for annulment, framed as a question of divine law, was in truth nothing more than lust dressed as theology. He argued that his marriage to Catherine was cursed because she had once been his brother's wife, that God had punished them with barrenness. Yet everyone at court knew the truth. It was not God's law Henry wanted, it was Anne. He pressured the Pope, he bribed cardinals, he bullied his own clergy. When Rome refused, Henry broke from it entirely, severing centuries of English faith to satisfy a single desire. Imagine the spectacle: priests forced to declare that the king's will was God's will, monasteries dissolved, lands seized, wealth pouring into the crown, all so that Henry could put Anne Boleyn in Catherine's place. Thousands lost livelihoods, the poor were cast out of once charitable abbeys, and the kingdom trembled under the weight of this upheaval. And yet, Henry presented it all as destiny. His lust had become law. Anne herself was not spared the danger of her own triumph. She had resisted Henry's bed for so long, but once crowned queen in 1533, the very power that protected her now trapped her. Expectations pressed heavy. She had to deliver a son. But her first child was Elizabeth, a girl. The irony was sharp, though history would later reveal Elizabeth to be England's greatest ruler. For Henry, however, it was disappointment. His desire was insatiable and his patience short. Think about it. Would you, in Anne's place, believe that love could tame such a king? Or would you see from the start that desire was only another kind of prison? The very passion that had lifted Anne Boleyn to the throne soon became the fire that consumed her. Henry's adoration turned to restlessness, and restlessness to suspicion. She had risked everything, even the stability of England, to become his queen. Yet to Henry, none of it mattered if she could not provide him with a living son. Anne's second pregnancy ended in miscarriage, the child reportedly male. To Henry, this was proof not of his own failing health or age, but of Anne's unworthiness. Rumors began to swirl, whispers that she was too flirtatious, that her sharp tongue and quick wit made enemies at court. Some even accused her of witchcraft, claiming her allure had bewitched the king into madness. In a world where superstition mingled with politics, such whispers were lethal. By 1536, the storm broke. Anne was arrested on charges so grotesque they stunned even her enemies. Adultery with multiple men, conspiracy against the king, even incest with her own brother. The accusations were flimsy, manufactured by Henry's chief minister Thomas Cromwell. But in Tudor England, evidence was unnecessary when the king demanded guilt. Picture the scene: the Queen of England, once courted with poetry and promises, now dragged to the Tower in disgrace. Men who had once bowed before her were executed for supposed affairs, their blood staining the cobblestones as her own death approached. Henry, meanwhile, paraded at jousts and banquets, his eyes already fixed on Jane Seymour, Anne's lady-in-waiting. On May 19, 1536, Anne walked to the scaffold. Dressed in crimson, the colour of martyrs, she addressed the crowd with dignity, proclaiming loyalty to the very man who had condemned her. The French executioner raised his sword, and in a single stroke, the woman who had changed the course of English religion was silenced. Henry feasted that very night. Tell me, how quickly do you think love can turn to hate when lust is the only foundation it rests on? Anne Boleyn's body was barely cold when Henry married Jane Seymour. Unlike Anne's fiery defiance, Jane was gentle, submissive, a woman who promised peace after years of chaos. Henry called her his true love, his most beloved wife. Yet her worth to him, like the others, lay in one thing only: her womb. In 1537, Jane gave birth to a son, Edward. At last, Henry's obsession seemed fulfilled: a legitimate male heir. Bells rang across England, processions filled the streets, and Henry basked in triumph. But joy was short-lived. Jane died days later from postnatal complications. Henry dressed in mourning, proclaiming eternal grief, yet within weeks his council began arranging another match. Even Jane, the so-called perfect queen, was reduced to a vessel that had served its purpose. By 1540, Henry was aging, his body thickened by gluttony and disease. Still, his desires had to be fed, and his advisers sought to strengthen England through a foreign alliance. Enter Anne of Cleves, a German princess. Hans Holbein painted her portrait. a soft, serene face that promised beauty and fertility. But when Henry met her in person, he recoiled. "I like her not," he declared, mocking her appearance and humiliating her before all Europe. He claimed she smelled, that she was untrained in courtly manners, that she was unfit for a king's bed. The marriage lasted 6 months. Henry never consummated it, calling her his Flanders mare. Yet here lies the irony. Anne survived. She accepted annulment with grace, took the title of king's sister, and lived in wealth and comfort while others perished. Unlike Catherine or Anne Boleyn, Anne of Cleves was wise enough to step aside, preserving her life by yielding rather than resisting. But what does survival mean when it is purchased through humiliation? If you were Anne, would you have fought for the crown or accepted disgrace to keep your head? She was barely more than a child when the aging tyrant fixed his gaze upon her. Catherine Howard, cousin to the ill-fated Anne Boleyn, was thrust forward by her ambitious family like a lamb to slaughter. Imagine the scene: a 15-year-old girl paraded before a king swollen with disease, his legs rotting, his body bloated, yet still convinced of his irresistible virility. And he believed she adored him. He called her his rose without a thorn, smothering her in jewels and praise, blind to the terror that lingered in her eyes. But Catherine's past was not as spotless as Henry demanded. Whispers of earlier encounters, relationships we would today call abuse, surfaced, shattering the king's fragile fantasy. For Henry, it was unthinkable that his young bride had belonged to others. His desire had to be pure, untouched, divinely sanctioned. And when reality intruded, rage consumed him. The court shuddered as Catherine was dragged to trial, accused of adultery, a crime twisted into treason when committed against the king. She was scarcely more than a teenager, yet condemned to die like the wives before her. They say she practiced laying her head upon the block so she could meet death with dignity. Can you imagine that? A child rehearsing for execution because a king could not bear his illusion to be broken. Her end in 1542 was a spectacle of horror, a warning to every woman in England that youth itself was no protection. Henry's sexual reign of terror had reached its darkest point. And I must ask you, if you had been in Catherine's place, could you have found the courage to face the axe? By the time Henry claimed Catherine Parr as his 6th wife in 1543, the once golden prince had rotted into a monstrous shell of a man. He was obese beyond recognition, perhaps 400 pounds, his body crippled by ulcers that oozed pus, his breath fouled by decay. Yet he still demanded the devotion of a queen. Catherine Parr understood better than anyone before her. This was not a marriage of love, but of survival. She played the only role left to her: nurse, caretaker, cautious companion. Instead of passion, she offered gentle obedience. Instead of resistance, she offered silence. And it saved her life. Henry had executed queens for less than an ill-chosen word, and Catherine nearly joined them when her reformist religious views offended him. One slip, one wrong sentence about God, and even she faced charges of heresy. Only quick wit and desperate humility convinced Henry that she was his faithful servant rather than a rival preacher. Imagine living like that. Married to a king, yet sleeping beside a man whose body was collapsing under its own weight, while knowing every breath could be your last if his paranoia awoke. Catherine Parr survived not by love or beauty, but by learning when to soothe, when to flatter, and when to vanish into silence. Her marriage revealed the final stage of Henry's decline. He was no longer the hunter, but the crippled tyrant, clutching at authority as his body betrayed him. And tell me, if you were Catherine, would you have dared to speak your mind? Or would you too have chosen silence to live another day? When Henry VIII finally died in 1547, England was left scarred in ways far deeper than a crown could hide. 6 wives, 2 beheaded, 1 discarded as ugly, another dead in childbirth, and countless mistresses and servants used, forgotten, or destroyed. What he called love was nothing more than tyranny dressed in silk. What he saw as divine right was in truth a reign of fear, where a king's bedroom became the executioner's stage. His obsession with producing a male heir tore apart families, rewrote laws, and shattered England's bond with Rome. Priests who resisted his marital whims were burned as heretics. Noble houses sent daughters to court as though they were offerings to a god, knowing they might return disgraced, or not at all. Even his children bore the wounds. Mary grew bitter, Elizabeth grew cautious, and Edward, the long-awaited son, would not live to see manhood. Henry's desperate pursuit of virility left him with only broken heirs and a fractured kingdom. Look around, the England we know was forged in that crucible of lust and cruelty. The Church of England exists because one man could not accept rejection. The rhyme children still chant, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, reduces centuries of blood and terror to a nursery jingle. And what does that say about the scars he left behind? Henry went to his grave unrepentant, convinced God had blessed every murder, every betrayal, every bed he claimed as his own. His story is not just history, it is a warning. Absolute power, when fused with unchecked desire, can consume not only lives, but entire nations. And I ask you, if a ruler today turned private lust into public law, would we recognize it before it was too late?